The city of Chicago has some interesting ideas for Soldier Field to try and keep the Bears downtown. It just doesn't seem like any of the proposals will quite do the trick.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, we start with proposed upgrades for Soldier Field. A major concourse, a dome, a hotel, extra parking, more pavilions, using more of the lake, so much more coming from the city of Chicago as part of this push to keep the Bears from moving to Arlington Heights. But we'll kind of look at what the proposals are and what that fits in with, where it does and doesn't fit in with the Chicago Bears goals and desires, and this idea of, like, you know, for the fans versus for the team, and how those goals might sometimes align and sometimes not quite align, and this idea of a dome over a historically, you know, natural outdoor type of environment for Chicago football. And we'll talk more broadly about what the Bears need and don't need from either a stadium in Arlington Heights or upgrades to what they have downtown. It feels like some level of public negotiating, some level of public pressure, perhaps, of the city of Chicago showing the Bears, like, hey, we've got ideas. We're trying things. We want to show this football organization that the city values them and wants to keep them downtown, as opposed to losing that major, mainstay of the organization to Arlington Heights and the suburbs. And we know this is a slow process. We know nothing is locked in for Arlington Heights at this point, just that the Bears are very clearly showing a strong interest in that. And we know, like, the mayor of Chicago and the city has kind of played this, like, back and forth game of, like, trying to play hardball and now trying to sort of soften up and come around to the Bears and that whole sort of Soldier Field campus in downtown Chicago, right? They have the sort of, like, museum in there too. It's a big, I think it's about 57 acres. They want to now come forward and say, okay, Bears, we know you're looking at Arlington Heights. What if we did all this? And they've made this whole list of ideas. Not a specific proposal, but there have been some renderings. But it's not like it's to the stage of, like, an exact dollar amount and an exact timeline or anything like that, but just more like, here's some ideas for Soldier Field that some city committee within a council type of thing has looked at. I think it's considered a working group for ideas for Soldier Field that included, you know, like building more like a tourist attraction event venue type of area around Soldier Field. The main headline grabber attention thing, first and foremost, was it started with just, like, putting a dome on Soldier Field to be able to make it indoors in the case of certainly inclement winter weather, but also, you know, rain, and pretty much rain or shine, be able to host more events there, which may include then also, like, a World Cup or more concerts, especially, you know, in the winter when an outdoor venue like Soldier Field wouldn't be as palatable for, you know, artists or fans trying to go see that artist in frigid weather. It's bear weather for football, not as much weather for rock and roll or hip hop or whatever band that they would want to bring in there. But this idea of, like, adding, I think they were looking at, like, a monorail or some kind of, like, aerial gondola type transportation around there, a hotel, this big, like, pedestrian plaza, and kind of put, you know, find other places for parking around there, maybe use the river a little bit more for, like, some floating pavilions was something that was floated out there as well, and make it this full-on like park district entertainment center in addition to Soldier Field, which sounds cool, right? I mean, yes, like tailgating and stuff is a ton of fun at Soldier Field, and there's a ton of history at the stadium, and that would be preserved largely, but being able to add all these other things to do and make it this more, hip happening area for people to come down to and congregate and have a good time at all sounds fine and dandy from the city's perspective. It sounds like it would be very good for the city of Chicago, and that's a big reason why they're proposing it. But if you're the Chicago Bears, does that help you at all? I mean, the Dome is a separate discussion that we'll have in a minute here, but this idea of like, if you're the football team and you look at Soldier Field and maybe looking at what a new arena might be able to provide you, a new stadium in Arlington Heights, for example, does adding, a big pedestrian area and a hotel and maybe a monorail type thing, does that help the Chicago Bears organization? It's not as though they have a ton of trouble selling tickets. It would seem like, yes, Soldier Field has its flaws, and we'll get into some of those as well. But when the team is good, they sell out every game for sure. And I think most games they still sell out. They don't always have full capacity. Not everyone shows up, but the games sell out. And it would seem like whether or not the Bears sell out and have a full house seems to be most dependent on how good the team is, and doesn't seem to be very dependent on Soldier Field. You don't have, as far as I can tell, I've never experienced a Bears fan who says, you know what, I really like the Chicago Bears, but Soldier Field just doesn't do it for me, so I don't want to go see the team because there's nothing to do around Soldier Field. I just don't think that's an experience that very many Bears fans have. You might say, well, Soldier Field has a very small seating capacity, and therefore ticket prices are too high, and so I don't want to spend the money to go see the Chicago Bears at Soldier Field. That's a separate discussion. But adding all these event space and pedestrian walkways and hotel and all sorts of attractions outside of Soldier Field doesn't seem to solve any of those types of problems is almost a strong word, but the real sort of considerations that the Bears are having about Soldier Field versus potentially moving to Arlington Heights. The Dome comes the closest to having a real impact on this Bears team. And we'll look at that idea of a dome and sort of the outdoor football, Chicago weather type situation compared to Arlington Heights next on Locked On Bears. I'm a little surprised there aren't odds on whether or not the Chicago Bears will move or not, but there's plenty of other Bears odds with our friends at betonline.net, the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. I mean, even though we're in July, in the dead part of the offseason, you can still look ahead to this NFL season. The Bears' Week 1 matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, for example. The Bears are 6-point underdogs in that game. You can bet on the Bears' win total this upcoming season, over under 6.5. Bears odds to make the playoffs are a bit of a long shot. Plus, upcoming basketball futures. You got Major League Baseball season, hockey futures, golf, soccer, tennis, boxing, UFC, you name it. Our friends at betonline.net are the best spot for all of your betting needs. The fastest and easiest way to check on all the different events. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The discussion about Soldier Field upgrades for the Bears starts with the Dome. Yes, the winds of downtown Chicago make Soldier Field a rather treacherous playing environment, and one that is somewhat an advantage for the Bears, but not exclusively, right? Of course, there's this idea of home field advantage, but the winds specifically, that yes, the Bears are much more used to the swirling winds, especially in the end zones. Kickers like Robbie Gould became a master of how to aim into those Soldier Field winds, and that opposing kickers would come in and not necessarily be as familiar with those winds. I don't know, given the turnover the Bears had at kickers in recent season, that seemed to no longer be an advantage. Now you have Cairo Santos, who has been here now for a couple of seasons and might have more of a consistent understanding of how to adapt to those winds, but it's not as though that, the quarterbacks or whatever, or the receivers have had to adjust and provide some massive home field advantage due to the environment in Chicago. And ever since they sort of upgraded the turf, that doesn't seem to be the same way it was, like in the late Lovie Smith era and stuff, where the grass was just so bad and it was like an advantage for the Bears to know how to cut and and move, change directions in that terrible Soldier Field grass, and other teams would slip and fall all the time, and that was almost like a home field advantage. That's all changed, and a dome wouldn't really necessarily affect that either. It's just sort of this question of like, okay, how much does a dome add for the Bears, right? The Winds may not be a home field advantage per se, but is it hurting them? Do they gain anything from having the dome on there? There's certainly this feeling of like, I think there was a backlash right away of no, much like Green Bay and Lambeau Field, Soldier Field is, it's not called the frozen tundra the same way, but it's like there's Bear football weather that, these warm weather teams from Florida or California, when they visit Chicago in December and even November, but more optimistically January in the playoffs, they face something that they're not as acclimated to and as used to. I think back to like the Seahawks and the Saints coming into that 2006 playoff run to the Super Bowl, right? And not that the weather was the reason the Bears won those games, because the Bears were clearly the better team for a lot of those games. But there's something about that, especially in those winter weathers. We don't notice it as much because the Bears haven't been playing into January very consistently. But I do think there's something to it when the Saints come from a dome, or even like to a lesser extent, when the Vikings play in a dome at US Bank Stadium and then come to Chicago in December. Not that they're completely unused to the cold weather, but there is a little bit of something about that. And there's just this sort of aura and atmosphere of Chicago cold weather football, tough-nosed, that there's no way to really fully measure how it impacts football games. And given that it's not like the Bears have some better record in December compared to other months. Like it doesn't have this direct correlation specifically to win-loss that's super clear and obvious, but it does feel like it makes the Bears just feel like a tougher team that time of year. That there's just something about like that they're more resilient, they're more not battle tested, but they're just, because the conditions are not always supreme, that's something that they gain experience working through that other teams do not. And whether or not that, whether it specifically adds to more wins is different than just like it making the Bears feel like a tougher, stronger team and their ability to deal with adversity and conditions that are less than ideal feels like it adds something. And that's not to say that like there's no value to a dome whatsoever, but it does feel like it takes something away from Chicago Bears football. Now, the sort of double-edged sword of that is, of course, moving to Arlington Heights would likely probably have a dome on there. I mean, if they're going to build a brand new stadium, and everything we've heard about Arlington Heights is sort of a similar proposal to what the city proposed around Soldier Field in terms of making it a larger event space and venue, and maybe build hotels and restaurants around the new stadium in the same way that they're talking about doing that in Chicago. The big difference being some of the things a brand new stadium could provide that Soldier Field is lacking. And that's part of the bigger point that we'll get to in a little bit here. So it's like, you could say adding a dome to Soldier Field would be disappointing and would be sort of, not disgraceful to Bears history, but sort of taking something away from what's been so historic about that outdoor cold weather fit stadium. But Arlington Heights presents largely the same idea, if not worse, because if you leave Soldier Field, like you're leaving historic NFL lands. You know what I mean? Like it's such a big part of Bears and NFL history at Soldier Field. So it's not as though the dome has any sort of added negatives that Arlington Heights would provide, or would include in this pro-con equation for the Chicago Bears. It's more so that it just doesn't seem like it really solves the problems. Not that there's problems, but, it doesn't doesn't match the benefits that a brand new stadium in Arlington Heights would have. And it seems to me like, you put out these renderings, you put out all these ideas, which are just ideas and don't even have, guaranteed funding or support behind them necessarily. But it feels like much more of like a fan pressure game of like the city saying, see, we're trying to make Soldier Field better so if the Bears leave, the fans can be, I guess, mad at the Bears and not mad at the city for not trying to keep the Bears, I guess. I mean, that's what it feels more like, a public pressure game that, try and get the fan pressure on them, but the Bears don't necessarily seem to fully care about the fan pressure. That's not to be like a criticism of them, but like, I don't think the fans really wanted them to move training camp to Hallis Hall from Bourbonnais, and they kind of just did and said, deal with it. We're the Chicago Bears. You're going to come anyway because you love this team. And that's kind of what it comes down to, right? The Bears can kind of do whatever they want, and they know the fans will come. Arlington Heights is a little bit of Field of Dreams, right? Like if you build it, they'll be mad at first, but they'll come. They will come. I mean, people are not going to stop going to Bears games just because, if they leave Soldier Field. And especially if Arlington Heights is able to provide some of the benefits that Soldier Field is unable to provide. And we'll kind of look at, what's lacking at Soldier Field and what a new stadium outside of the city could provide and how that really is what this boils down to a bit more next on Locked On Bears. It's a lot of different moving parts when it comes to changing stadiums and moving teams, but hey, nobody knows more about moving parts than our friends at RockAuto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for everybody, and they've got everything you could possibly need for your vehicle. You don't have to be a mechanic, but you can find anything your mechanic might want. Engine control modules, fuel pump assemblies, to easy stuff like tires, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Whatever you need, RockAuto.com has it for you, and their prices are hard to beat. The chain part stores in Yorktown might have a lower price tier for professional mechanics compared to do-it-yourselfers like us. But RockAuto.com's prices are universal. Same for everyone. Don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Head on over to RockAuto.com today and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box when you check out, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. It's no secret that Soldier Field is the smallest venue in the NFL, and that it's on the older side. I mean, it's not like old. It got renovated in the early 2000s, and those were significant and important and appreciated and valuable. But compared to some of the newer NFL stadiums, it's got character. That's sort of the nice way you describe Soldier Field, and that's part of like the history of it and the historic nature, and of course how it honors soldiers and Soldier Field, the military. And there's a lot of value to that makes this difficult. But, when you look at what the Raiders built in Las Vegas, you look at SoFi Stadium in LA, I think it's Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas. I mean, I don't care to give the sponsors of those stadium extra naming recognition. The Rams and Charger Stadium in LA, the Raider Stadium in Vegas, right? The newer NFL stadiums are really, really nice. I mean, it's hard when you don't physically, if you haven't physically been there, to really get a sense of like, oh, this is nice. This is what a really nice stadium looks like. Because you go to Soldier Field, and it's not like it's run down. It's not like the concrete is falling apart everywhere, or that it's like, like super, super antiquated in the sense of like how people, like human traffic, people flow through the stadium and in and out. It's not like you go there and it's like obviously a dump. Like I was at Qualcomm Stadium, which was the Chargers' old stadium in San Diego before they left. The Holiday Bowl was out there. I covered a Holiday Bowl game one year. And like you could tell, Qualcomm Stadium was just not up to NFL standards. And not that the concrete was totally falling apart. It wasn't like a safety hazard or anything, but they had these like weird sort of like spirally ramps around the outside that just didn't make a lot of sense. And like you could just tell it was built a while ago, and that we've just gotten a lot better at knowing how to arrange a stadium, knowing what to put in stadiums, and knowing how to just make it a nicer, better fan experience. So Soldier Field's not there. It's not like desperately got to get out of here because this place is just a dump, but it is small. And like we talked about earlier, people aren't skipping Bears games or anything because the stadium's not state of the art. But when you only have 60 some odd thousand seats or whatever it is at Soldier Field, it does make Bears games expensive for people that might not have a ton of disposable income. I think capacity is 61.5, and when those Bears tickets against good teams are $200, $300, $400 a person, a family of four, that becomes $1,000+ type of thing, and not everybody can afford that, and it does limit some of the opportunities of Bears fans. I mean, of course, you can go to the games against the Lions games, or in years past, or the other bad teams, and find more affordable tickets, especially on the resale market. Like, not every game is super expensive and completely out of everyone's price range, but a bigger stadium would mean more fans. It's sort of the supply and demand, right? It's that if the supply is limited to 61,000, and that's the least amount of supply in the NFL, demand is going to be higher, and then ticket price can then go higher because there's high demand and low supply. But if you created a stadium that had, I don't even know exactly what new stadiums are going nowadays, but 80,000, 100,000, all of a sudden, it's 20,000 extra seats, 20,000 extra tickets that not only make tickets then more affordable for more Bears fans, but then also have even more fans in the stadium to make even more noise, and maybe, not that it would create that much more of a home field advantage, but an even better game day experience. Like, again, Bears Stadium Soldier Field is not lacking in, fan energy by any means. Bears fans show out and make a big difference at Soldier Field. But it just feels like, adding a dome or adding a hotel and adding a pedestrian light, it's all like nice things, but it's not getting at the things that really matter to the Chicago Bears. Like, a brand new stadium would have better locker rooms, better showers, better facilities, better fan experience, better everything for the players and the coaches and the referees and the fans and everybody. And it would seem like, given Soldier Field's physical dimensions and being a little bit locked into that, lakefront downtown area, unless you completely demolished Soldier Field and tried to rebuild something, but then the Bears would need to play somewhere and someone would need to pay for that. And plus all the history of Soldier Field, doesn't seem like you would want to specifically demolish it, but I don't know that you can just gut it. I'm not an engineer in any way, but there's not this nice solution where somehow you make Soldier Field fit all the things the Bears would want from a brand new stadium while still keeping it downtown and keeping it Soldier Field in some sort of plausible way. So then it comes down to either move to Arlington Heights and get everything you want, but just not be downtown, or keep dealing with the limitations. I think that's a good word. The limitations of Soldier Field. And plus, I don't know that the city of Chicago could afford to demolish, because it's run by the Parks Department, so I don't know who would pay for all that, but it doesn't feel like there's a super clear path towards staying at Soldier Field. It's not to say that Arlington Heights is guaranteed to happen, because a lot of hoops have to be jumped through to build a brand new stadium, and the NFL has to jump in on, has to be involved in that, and design and the money, and I'm sure Arlington Heights city government has a say in a lot of this, and how that all gets paid for is complicated and in no way guaranteed to happen. It just feels like that seems like the more desirable path for the Chicago Bears, and I can't say at this point the more likely path, because I'm not familiar with the local politics of Arlington Heights and everything that goes into that, but all this coming out from the city of Chicago all sounds like nice ideas that are probably a little bit more so ideas and less likely to happen and keep the team in Chicago. We'd love to hear what you think about what the Bears should do, whether Soldier Field is the place they should stay because it's worth it in the history, or whether you're okay with them going to Arlington Heights, or would you be more okay with it if ticket prices were cheaper and the game day experience was better? Is that enough to overcome, the loss of Soldier Field and the history of that? Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. Tweet us at Locked On Bears on Twitter. Comment on Locked On Bears on Facebook, or join the Locked On Bears Facebook group. Plenty of ways to interact with the show and be a part of that conversation. So I hope you'll join in with us this offseason. I appreciate you following along and listening to Locked On Bears every day that we are here for you. Hope you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. Don't forget the Locked On Podcast Network has Locked On shows for all of your Chicago sports. Locked On Bulls especially has been killing it all offseason. Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, Locked On Blackhawks as well. We're all here for you. So I hope the Locked On Podcast Network is giving you all of your daily sports needs. And most importantly, that the Locked On Bears podcast is making it easier for you to bear down.